Thank you everyone for joining us today for our webinar, Cybersecurity, What Does It Mean to Protect Your Organization with Ihloom Cybersecurity Company. Before I pass it over, I want to give thanks to Needham Bank for sponsoring this webinar. I think it's a tough time for a lot of businesses, so cybersecurity is on everyone's mind. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Jeremy Loudon from Ihloom Cybersecurity.
Thanks, Maxime, for the introduction. We're certainly happy to be here and joining with you all today. Just want to start sharing out the slides here, and we'll get into things. Okay. So as Maxime said, we are Ihloom Cybersecurity. We are a managed security services provider based in Needham, Massachusetts. What we mean by managed security services provider, you may be familiar with a managed services provider, essentially just outsourced IT. We have a similar model, but we focus solely on cybersecurity. Our specific focus is working with small and medium-sized businesses, and our goal is really to help everyone understand their current level of cybersecurity risk and get protected. We meet our clients where they're at. Everyone's at a different place. We try to understand where you are and where you might want to go or where you might need to go based on a couple different factors. We have, change slides. Again, myself, Jeremy Loudon, Director of Business Operations here at Ihloom, and also joined today by Garrett Brown, who's our founder and CEO, 20 plus years of IT experience, and is also the founder of Mantra Computing, which is a managed services provider, also based in Needham. So with that, Garrett, I'll hand things over to you and let you take it away.
Thanks, Jeremy. Appreciate the introduction and the welcome. I think all of us are familiar with the idea of cybersecurity. It's in the news, and the threats can seem overwhelming and scary. So what we're going to try and do here is really break it down into actionable pieces and help people understand what the problems actually are and the best ways to really address them as a business, a small and medium-sized business. And I guess, understanding what's going on really starts with understanding what the problem is and how we arrived at this point. So, one of the things that's happening is geography has become a thing of the past with the proliferation of the internet and the everything connected and cloud services. Geography really doesn't play a role in determining access anymore. And of course, this is what's driving the productivity of today and our post-COVID work environments and work from home. And so there are immense benefits to this, but somebody halfway across the world has equal access, equal ability to gain access to your resources. It's not like many of us who've been doing this for a while are used to having sort of a closed door approach where stuff sits in an office somewhere and access to that environment does either require physical access or some sort of protected VPN. So geography and accessibility are part of the problem. The other part of the problem here is the availability of information, which of course is a great benefit to all of us, but hacking tools, know-how, even things like ChatGPT, which are in the news these days, make sort of the ability to understand how to get around and access these types of technology much easier. And so, of course, there's things like people have heard the dark web, which is really just a more secretive or less published place where certain types of commerce take place or information is shared, things like the large disclosures of data, databases, usernames, passwords, email addresses. So the proliferation and access to information and know-how. And, it's also the proliferation of public information. So if we think about things like LinkedIn and Google, this information is available to us all. So a motivated attacker has the information to know who perhaps works in your business or what their role is within your business. They don't really have to know you very well. And then the last piece really is the ability to move funds around without traceability, so cryptocurrencies. Jeremy, if you want to move to the next slide. So this is just sort of a infographic, of what we were just talking about. The idea of closing and locking the front doors no longer works. Everything is connected to the internet now, or is moving in that direction. And I think one of the things that's important to think about is this trajectory, this movement towards the disappearing of geography is actually something that continues to get even more so. One thing that occurred to me the other day is there's this move towards a new protocol on the internet called IPv6, and there's a lot of controls out there in this sort of cybersecurity world that try and limit access to things by geography. And even that's going away with the newer IPv6 protocol. So this trajectory is going to continue. We're going to get closer and closer together. Data is going to become easier to access. Systems will continue to be easy to access over time. Jeremy, if you can move to the next slide. So the ability to work effectively from anywhere, provide access to systems, including staff, customers, clients, partners. This has resulted, as we all sort of experience, in this explosion of productivity and has many benefits for all of us. But it has also made us much bigger targets to threat actors. And when we kind of break things down, cybersecurity really is just risk management. So part of the process that we go through when we think about this is really figuring out what our risks are and figuring out the things we can do to limit those risks to us or make us less of a target. Many of us think intuitively about, say, home security. We might want to lock the front doors. We might want to, lock our windows. And in some cases, some people will feel there's some benefit to having a home alarm system. And I think we have to think about cybersecurity in the same way. None of us believe that if somebody really wants to get into our house, that those measures will prevent them from getting into the house. But what we're trying to do when we do those things is make us less of a target, shrink us as a target, make us less interesting to somebody who's interested in stealing or whatever their motivation might be. And so when we move into, you can leave that, that's okay, Jeremy, you can, when we move into how do we lock the doors, how do we close our windows, what are those efforts on the cybersecurity world? There are some evolving principles on the market, which we'll talk a little bit more later today, but I think some of these terms that will be familiar to people, they're hearing them in the news, which is zero trust security models and defense in depth approaches. Jeremy, if you want to go to the next one. So, part of the idea here is we have to understand who are we protecting ourselves from? Who is this enemy, this boogeyman? And, having spent a lot of time in computers in the 90s, there was this idea that there were script kiddies in the basement writing viruses that were going to propagate and cause all sorts of people's troubles. And there was some evidence that existed. But today, that's really not what's happening. We're talking about really highly motivated attackers with time and financial resources, and they're motivated, well, for all sorts of reasons, and we'll talk about that. A lot of it is financial. But who are the groups and individuals that are perpetrating most of this stuff? There's government agencies. We hear about, in the context of Ukraine, the Russian aggression. We also hear about North Korea using cybersecurity and generating income to, support their regime. And then, of course, the U.S. is part of this. All the governments are moving in this direction to assert their dominance and ability in these areas. The next group is called APTs, or Advanced Persistent Threat Groups. And so these are often groups that are associated with government agencies, governments, but are more loosely associated. They might get funding or support from governments, and they're typically sort of the hitman of these organizations, these governments. There's hacktivist groups. These are generally less organized groups of people who are motivated by certain types of social cause or political movements. And then lastly, there are individuals and there's organized crime. And so these are people who are enterprising, financially motivated, sometimes work for hire, and are largely motivated financially. So, when we start talking to people, especially small businesses, there's often this perspective to say, well, we're a small business, we're too small. There's nothing in our environment that anybody would want. And even depending on the type of business you have, what are the risks around that? And then there's also this idea that, well, we're a pretty lean organization. We've put everything up in the cloud. We don't really have anything to protect. And of course, the cloud being Microsoft or Google or Amazon, they're protecting us. So we hear this sort of thing all the time. And, what I try and help people understand is, for most businesses, the attackers who they might be subject to are primarily opportunistic attacks. So these are, they're looking for people to compromise, but they're not looking specifically for those people. So for example, they might get a list of businesses in certain markets, and they would buy it just like any marketing effort. They might send out a very carefully crafted phishing email to that market, hoping that they might get some bites, which might speak to their market. They could even be a little bit more targeted, which are sometimes called spear phishing, where they might identify users in the email through a simple mail merge. So they're looking not necessarily for that one company, but they're looking for the opportunities that present themselves. And these attackers are like any business. They've got a marketing campaign, they've got budgets, they've got plans, to generate the income that they're looking to generate, or access that they're looking for. When I think about this, I often think about my son, because as a father, I was trying to sort of protect my home environment from the dangers of the internet. And, so we put limits on the internet in our house for certain times. We put limits on certain access to things on their phones and things like that. And the thing I really I underestimated was the motivation of an early teen kid who has plenty of time on their hands to figure out ways around it. And attackers are very similar. They've got plenty of time, got all the time in the world. They're very motivated, and they find ways around systems. And of course, my son managed to get around all the protections I put in place. So, this is, I think that's helpful. We can move on to the next slide, Jeremy. Small businesses, even if their information itself doesn't provide a lot of value, offer a lot of value to hackers. They are generally easier to compromise because they have less resources applied to the protections of their systems. They're easy targets for financial extortion and also cyber insurance money. But they also are great entry points to larger organizations, which might be the ultimate target for these attackers. So if you are providing services as a contractor, I know there was some information about a hack that happened in 2022 for Okta, which is a cybersecurity company providing an identity and access management to some large companies. And in fact, what happened in their case was it was a vendor of theirs who was compromised, a much smaller operator, and they had access to the Okta systems. So, that is an important piece of what the attackers are trying to get with smaller businesses. I think also of a few examples that we worked with a school district a few years ago, and we did an assessment for them. They were adamant that they were small, they had a small budget, they were concerned about protecting their environment, but they didn't think they were particularly a target. And when we did the assessment with them, we discovered, for example, that they had security cameras that were installed by a security company, but all those security cameras were publicly on the internet with default passwords, and they were very easily compromised. So, of course, they took care of that once we identified it, but it points out that there's lots of ways that small companies and small organizations can be compromised, and a lot of times it's through a third party, and which makes them a great target as well. Jeremy, if you want to move to the next slide here. This to sort of expand on this subject, what is it they really want with me? What is the value of my organization to a hacker potentially? To an attacker, every victim is another resource in their pocket to further additional attacks. So as we said, they get insurance money, they can defraud using money, they can use blackmail in terms of disclosure of your information, but they also use the information from your organization to target and get bigger fish. So access to systems, and so one example I like to tell people is we had a client who started working with us, and they lost a good amount of money to fraud due to cybercrime, several $100,000. And what happened with them was they were working with a Chinese manufacturer, and they were used to working with this manufacturer who, of course, is in a totally different time zone, and there were some language barriers. So their primary communication channel was email. And it turns out that the Chinese company, the manufacturing company, had been compromised. They didn't know it, but the attackers had gained access to their email system. So it seemed like over a month, they monitored the mailboxes they had access to identify the process and who was involved. And they set up, subsequent to that, a separate domain that was very similar to this Chinese company's domain, but they varied it. I think there was an I instead of an L or something like that. So they took an email conversation, and then they interjected at the right time a new email coming from this new domain, but they left all the historical email and the communication. So to the person who was at our clients, it seemed like it was just a continuation of an existing conversation. And they managed to manipulate them and have what became our client change payment information, so that instead of sending all that information to the manufacturer, payment information, they were sending it to the attackers. So, there's all sorts of creative ways where this information becomes very helpful to an attacker. Jeremy, if you could move to the next slide for me, that'd be great. So we hear this all the time. Well, look at, we outsource everything. It's all cloud-based. Our stuff is secure. We're not complicated. And it's really important to realize that, first of all, no system is unable, can be abused. All systems can be abused. And that usually these cloud providers do things like make some of the security or secure configurations a premium service. So you have to pay more to gain access. And many of them don't even enable or enforce the properly secured configurations because Often it's inconvenient, makes our products harder to use. So, for example, many products don't force you to turn on multi-factor authentication, things like that. And the other piece to keep in mind is when you engage with a company who's providing services as a subscription or a cloud or SaaS, that they have what are known as SLAs or service level agreements, and this stipulates their commitments to you as a provider. But a lot of those SLAs really leave a lot to be desired in terms of data backups. They may talk, for example, about system availability, making sure that the system is available, a certain amount of time. They may even talk about data integrity, but they don't provide meaningful backup language. So I can give you some specific examples, but this is true with Microsoft Office 365 and Google Workspaces. They are not providing backup of your data, as many people understand. So a number of years ago, we worked with a company, a manufacturer out of Florida, and they suffered a very terrible ransomware attack. They were using Dropbox, cloud service provider, for all their data storage. And what happened was the attackers were able to poison that data in such a way that they were able to overwrite the data repeatedly, causing all the versions for all their files to be overwritten. And so, fortunately for this company, they had one user who was syncing all these files offline to their computer and wasn't connected during the window of the attack. And so they were lucky, they got by, but they were able to get their data from that computer. So outsourcing in cloud is not necessarily a cure-all. It just means you have to understand those systems and how you protect them. So, as I said previously, cybersecurity is really an exercise in risk management. We can't eliminate all the risks, but what we can do, and what's meaningful, I think, for most businesses, is evaluating exactly where your data is, how you protect it, how your people access it, those risks, and try and put procedures, processes, and sometimes technology in place to make ourselves smaller targets. And I guess with that, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Jeremy, to discuss some of these practical steps and going through assessing your business.
Yeah, thanks, Garrett. So, I think really the first place to start, I want to define some of these terms that Garrett had mentioned earlier. One of them is really, the big one is defense in depth. And really what this means, you might hear this sometimes in the news. Defense in depth is really just multiple layers of defense. So if one control fails, there's another behind it to ensure that you're either still protecting access, or at least that you've monitored that access and you have some more evidence, once an attacker might gain entry to your systems. So when we think about defense in depth, the big one we talk about is two-factor authentication. This is a great form of defense in depth. So you have, a password that's on an account. What if something happens to that password? It's guessed, there's a disclosure, and the password is put out there to the public. Well, you have that second factor of authentication. So it's something you have. It's typically your phone. You're going to get a text message, or you go to the Authenticator app and you get a one-time, the bunch of numbers that you put in as sort of your one-time extra password. So when we think about layers, we want to think about things like two-factor authentication so that there's not a single point of failure. Not all security controls are designed to stop a hack or a breach from happening. So Garrett mentioned the home security analogy, and that's a great one. You lock your door, hopefully you lock your windows, maybe you don't leave your spare key in the fake plant by your front door. But if someone breaks in, what happens then? If you have a security system in place, you're alerted via your phone, someone calls you, there's an audible alarm, maybe your neighbor's here. Hopefully the security company, checks in with you, maybe calls the police. And then if you have really valuable things inside your house, maybe you're going to have security cameras. Maybe you're going to have a safe for jewelry or cash. And outside of those locks, none of the controls really prevented someone from breaking in. But hopefully, because of all these extra controls, maybe they took a painting, but they didn't get cash, or maybe the security cameras will help, scare someone away, so they're not going to stay in your house as quickly, or they're going to stay in your house for less time. Um, you made decisions about the security controls based on the level of risk. So the likelihood of occurrence in addition to your own level of risk tolerance. If you live in a high crime neighborhood, you're probably more likely to have some of these things in place. And again, just referencing what Garrett said earlier, security program management is really all about risk management. So every company has their own unique set of risks and tolerance for risk. And this is really why it's difficult. If you try to do any research into cybersecurity measures you should take yourself, it's really difficult to find one really great source of information just because everyone is in such a different place and everyone has their own level of risk. When we mention, understand that all protective systems will fail over time, it's not that cybersecurity is ineffective or that the protections aren't worth putting in place. Again, it's just reiterating this idea of defense in depth and having multiple layers, so that if something fails, you have another layer in place to step up and keep yourself protected. Defense in depth can be a lot. We have this graphic here on the left that has all these different layers and different things that you can think of, and that's not even exhaustive. It does help to have someone in charge in your organization who is a security program manager, someone who's in charge of the security program and can help all your different departments and teams work together to implement security protocols. Thinking about some of the first steps, good security, you really need to understand what it is that you're trying to protect. And so when we start to work with businesses, or if we do a risk assessment, or if we're just talking, things that they might want to consider, the first step is really understanding the technology and data that you have. So technology, your purchase computers, servers, cloud systems, phones, tablets, anything that you've bought, it really does help to have an inventory of all of that. And you also want to think about software. So do you have operating systems that are old? If you have a Windows environment and you're still running Windows 7, those computers aren't getting security updates anymore. So understanding that, we used to think about buying a computer and, can I get 6, 7, 8 years out of it? You kind of need to understand a lot of manufacturers have moved to, tying in security. They only put out security updates for quote unquote modern systems. So maybe an operating system only gets 5 years of security updates. You need to be able to plan your updating process accordingly. So understanding what operating systems you have in your environment, and then also installed software. This is important. You might be familiar with something that was called Log4j, and this was a vulnerability that came out a couple years ago. And it was baked into a lot of software that was out there. And so what we had to do for our clients is we had to identify software in their environment that had this vulnerability, help them identify all these different pieces of software and get them updated. So for our clients that already knew what pieces of installed software they had, what software they purchased, it was a lot easier. For some of the other clients that didn't, we had tools that were able to get a list of installed pieces of installed software and help them get patched. But understand that the software that's installed on your computers is another piece of the puzzle, and being able to understand what's installed is important. So that's kind of the technology piece, and then you have your data locations. So one of the big things, sorry, Garrett, did you want to jump in there? Okay. One of the big things with cybersecurity is understanding the data that you're trying to protect. So every business, whether it is going to be your business data itself, the proprietary information that makes your business run, whether it's your client data, which in Massachusetts is protected by law in certain ways, every business has a certain set of data that needs to be protected. So understanding what that data is, where it's located, where it should be located. Sometimes you might have someone who's been in the business for 10 years, 15 years, things have changed, they just store everything on their computer. Understanding that the security environment is different now, and sort of helping people understand why it's important to have data placed in certain locations. Well, it needs to be backed up. It needs to have two-factor authentication on it. So really kind of digging deep when you try to understand where your data is located. Sometimes we have people that have old computers that they just leave in their house. You might have tax data on it if you're an accounting firm. It's those kinds of questions that you need to be asking and understanding where this data lives and what you need to be doing with it.
Oh, Jeremy, I was just going to. Oh, I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
sure. No, go.
I was just going to say that, really this is not that complicated. It's really just understanding where your data is and how you store it. But the problem, of course, in technology is that it's sort of out of sight, out of mind. It's kind of one of those things where you just know where to go get it, but you never see it. And I think that's the biggest challenge for many businesses. And so the idea of saying, well, I store it here, this is how I store it, this is who has access to it, this is how I protect it. Those are the pieces that are most companies aren't doing effectively if they're doing it at all, and which really is the primary part that needs to happen.
Whoa. Sorry, I don't know why we are flipping through all of the slides. Thanks, Garrett. So, and that's great. Yeah. So, once you understand, where your data is located, you can think about how that data is accessed, both internally and externally. We talked a little bit about third-party risk. Are you giving access to contractors? Are you giving access to any other vendors? Have you hired someone to do something and they have access? Understanding how all of these data flows work within your organization and also externally. And from there, then you can really start evaluating your existing security controls, seeing if where you're keeping things, does it meet some of the law regulations that you might need to comply with, and does it meet your business needs as well. You also can sit down and understand the risk to your business. So, if I have a data set that I'm supposed to be protecting, say I have client data, I'm a doctor's office and I have client medical records, it's protected by HIPAA. What's going to happen to my business if that data, I put here if something bad happens. So if there's a data breach and that data is leaked, if someone comes into my office and takes some paper records, obviously a little different than electronic data, but your risk is going to be your likelihood of occurrence sort of multiplied by the impact to your business. So a data breach, having all your patient records getting out there on the internet is probably a high impact to your business. But that's really, that kind of conversation is really something that you need to have internally, that some of the answers to those questions are not things that anyone besides you as the business owner or as a leadership team can really understand and define. If you don't know where to start yourself by understanding risk or taking some of the first steps we talked about, you can undergo sort of a more formal process. It's called a security risk assessment or security gap assessment. And they can really help you understand some of the answers to all those questions. So what systems do you have in place? What are your procedures for accessing your data? And what are some of the risks that your business might face based on what you're doing already? You want to make sure that the assessment is based on a security framework. A security framework is really just, it's a mixture of security controls that are put together by a standards-based organization. So the main one that we like to utilize is the NIST cybersecurity framework. NIST is a federal organization and they write standards for all sorts of things. I think from food items, like I think they have a standard of peanut butter for the entire country. They measure time. They also have a set of security controls. So the federal government follows what's called the NIST 800 series, 800-53, and there's a bunch of other subsets of those controls. They have one for the public sector called the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, or the NIST CSF. And at the end of an assessment, you would be able to take home a report, talk about where you are, some gaps in your protection, some of the risks you might face, and give you some actionable items to actually close some of these security gaps. In terms of things that we recommend that everyone have right now, there's a lot. If you've ever tried to take a look at security controls that are out there, you might be overwhelmed. these four that we list here are really sort of the four big ones. We think about EDR, endpoint detection and response. Basically, it's the idea of, you have this protective software on your computers, but someone needs to be there to respond to any threats or alerts that come in. So we have the detection part, which is the software, and the response part, which is usually a staff. So that can go to someone on your team, or that can be outsourced. Multi-factor authentication, of course, is a big one. Anything that's connected to the internet, just assume that the passwords are going to be guessed over time or leaked, or there's going to be something that happens. So multi-factor is really a must. Logging and monitoring. I'm sorry that I keep flipping through the slides here. Logging and monitoring is a must. Again, this is one of these configuration things that by default, there's not going to be a ton of logging enabled on every single system. So making sure that your logs are enabled and making sure, ideally, that you're sending them somewhere off-site is a great idea. And of course, backups. We all know that having backups is incredibly important. You want those the backups to be offline, so disconnected from your network somehow. We'll see that referred to as an air-gapped backup. And you also want them to be immutable, or basically once that backup is made, it can't be changed. A common thing we see with hackers is trying to overwrite backups once they've been taken. I'm trying to get through these last couple of slides here pretty quickly, just because I know we're running short on time. Security framework, like I said, it's really just a collection of security controls that's been developed. Some examples of security frameworks, I mentioned the NIST cybersecurity framework, that's free. Some of the other frameworks that are out there, you do have to pay for. So it's one of the big reasons we recommend the NIST CSF. There is a new version that's coming out this year that we're pretty excited about. Another framework that's out there that's free and is really helpful is the CIS Top 18. CIS is the Center for Internet Security. They're a nonprofit, and they do some great work. So it's another thing to check out. And I just want to talk about just briefly about laws and regulations. So a lot of the security frameworks that you see out there, NIST CSF or anything else like that, they're pretty broad. They're not very specific. So they're trying to cover your whole business and your lines of business, data you have, people you interact with. Laws and regulations are very specific. They're very narrow. Obviously, in the US, we don't really have many federal laws that regulate cybersecurity. So we're seeing some states that have laws, Massachusetts, California, Virginia, actually starting this year. And these are all based around data of residents of those states. So just mentioning sort of the difference there between those two things. Our last slide is really just talking about ongoing cybersecurity management. One of the things I think that frustrates a lot of people is that they, sometimes we'll talk to people and they say, "Oh, what do I need to buy?" And unfortunately, there are a lot of tools that can help you implement good cybersecurity practices and keep you protected. But it's really understanding that cybersecurity needs a lot of support. It needs a lot of support and buy-in from leadership of your business. It needs active management and review. If you have an information security policy that's put in place that details all the things we've talked about, what data you have, what you're doing to protect that data, if you're not reviewing the policy every year, it can get out of date very quickly. And so understanding that it's important to set aside time to review your security policies each year, your security practices, making sure they're up to date, and understanding that as your business changes, your security policies are going to have to change as well. So COVID was a big example of that. Literally overnight, many businesses went from working in an office 100% of the time to working remotely 100% of the time. And what we saw is that the protections that you had in place one day suddenly were not good or not as robust as they might be as when you were in the office all the time. So, in a normal business environment, you're not going to see a change like that happen that quickly. But just understand that as your business model changes, as your work environment changes, so too should your cybersecurity. And I guess the one last thing is just talking about the IT staff versus cybersecurity staff. IT staff have sort of different objectives from cybersecurity staff, right? Your IT staff is going to be focused primarily on uptime. So it's all the things you can see. Is my computer working? Can I print? Is my internet working? That kind of thing. There may be people on your IT team who have specific cybersecurity knowledge, and that's great. You should really enable them to focus on implementing their knowledge. But understand that oftentimes, if all things are equal, a lot of times the uptime battle wins. So, um, you know, just thinking about cybersecurity is not happening unless you're asking about it, unless you're trying to ensure that some of these policies and procedures are implemented. They're not necessarily going to happen overnight. So just keep that in mind as you go through this journey. And with that, I think if there are any questions, I don't see anything in the chat, but if
Jeremy, we did get one question. Yeah. And I think it's a good question. Deb Lockett asked if we'd be talking about security issues as it relates to Facebook and Instagram and losing control over those accounts. And I think, that is part of the assessment process. That is a part of one of the resources that you should be including in your assessment. What do we have in terms of social media for our organization? And how do we leverage social media? And how does losing control and access, provide a risk? And so that's going to be different for different types of businesses. For some businesses who use those tools to, communicate with customers and clients. So in the case of, say, a Twitter, things like that, and some types of retail might be providing promotion and other things. Some companies might be using those platforms, to establish trust. So how bad would it look if Ihloom's social media account were compromised? It would really affect our reputation and the message we're trying to deliver. And so I think it has to fall within that portfolio of those are the assets within your organization and what is the risk. And so if you're going to leverage those, how are you protecting them? Making sure that the credentials are securely stored, that you have multi-factor authentication, that you know who has access to those accounts. I once worked with somebody who did a lot of outsourcing, this person, and they engaged with an overseas person to do a lot of their administrative work. And it's an incredible, I know a lot of people are doing this. So, one of the things, though, he hadn't considered is that he was giving access to different types of accounts to this person in an overseas location who he's never really met. And the laws governing access are questionable at best. So, is that a reasonable risk? It may be, but maybe there's some ways to grant access to the resources that person needs that would still allow them to be effective in that. So, Deb, I hope I answered your question.
We have another question from Kay. I guess it's a two-parter. Does having your home computers on a landline help? And could other computers that you communicate with that are not landlined compromise access to your landline computer?
Jeremy, you want me to respond to that?
Sure.
So I think, it used to be, and actually this subject gets kind of complicated by a lot of marketing vaporware around VPNs, but the idea being that, when you sort of own the environment, you have more visibility. So, is the underlying question here is if I go out, if I'm on a public Wi-Fi, am I at greater risk, right? If I'm at home and I'm plugged into my home network, is there risk? And, the answer is maybe. So if we just talk about public Wi-Fi for a minute and the risks associated with that and the discussion around VPN, I think it might be helpful. So people talk about going to public Wi-Fis and the risk associated with that. And it's true, there could be a risk related to joining an unknown network who somebody else could control, so they could route your traffic differently. They could potentially inspect your traffic depending on if you're doing things over HTTPS. So there's some risk involved in that. But a lot of those risks nowadays are mitigated by reputable public Wi-Fi, assuming you're joining a Starbucks Wi-Fi, for example. They should have things in place called isolation, so the different computers on that network shouldn't be able to talk to each other, for example. But let's say an attacker sets up a public Wi-Fi that looks similar to Starbucks and you join that, that's a risk. But there's a lot of marketing on the market talking about VPNs today. And, I spoke to a doctor who, said that somebody told him he should have a VPN on his phone and to protect the data because he was communicating with patients and that was an important thing to him. But it turns out he put on some VPN that was not reputable, and he was suddenly sending all his traffic to some overseas entity that was monitoring and collecting all that information. So there are some reputable VPNs, but they don't necessarily solve that problem. And I would say that if you are home and you are plugging in, or you're in an office and you're plugging into a wired network, you are certainly eliminating some of those variables rather than working in a public or shared networking environment. But I do encourage you to think more broadly about your security. How are you making sure that machine is fully patched? Making sure patching the machine that you have endpoint detection and response, antivirus, things like that. So it's part of a bigger consideration. I know we're out of time. I'm sorry I talked too long.
No, I think it was all great things. Thank you so much, Garrett and Jeremy. I'll send the recording along with their contact information. So if you have more questions, you can reach out to them. But have a nice day, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.